This is the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso. I'm joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. It's been a couple weeks. We have a new governor. This probably is the biggest change that's happened between two shows since we started the podcast way back in 2016. Certainly since you and I have been doing it over the last couple of years. Before we get into topics, and we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about, we're going to talk about some of the headlines, but we're going to kind of frame it within the questions that we've been seeing over the last 2 weeks or so that we've been getting on social media and email and so forth. First things first, though, what were your thoughts, Ted, on just sort of this abrupt announcement of Governor Cuomo's resignation and what a lot of people felt like was kind of a bizarre transition from Cuomo to Hochul?
Well, I think he held on as long as he could. I think he thought he would be able to ride it out, and frankly, I did too. I thought he'd ride it out and be reelected, but it was just becoming increasingly clear that wasn't going to be the case. So I think he saw the handwriting on the wall and decided it was time to get out. There's no real blueprint for doing something like this, I mean, to make it smoother. And then you had, what was interesting is in the early going is Kathy Hochul was walking this kind of fine line between, I'm a key part of the administration, I'm qualified to do this, but I wasn't there when any of the bad stuff happened. And so, you know, the question is still open, what's the Hochul administration going to look like? I mean, she released the new higher COVID numbers, which I think everyone knew was going to be one of the first things coming out of her administration. So other than that, we really haven't seen enough yet to know how it's going to be different. Howard Zucker is still the health commissioner. That's raising a few questions since he was pretty heavily involved in the whole nursing home number thing. So, you know, it's still a work in progress, and we'll just have to let time tell us what the Hochul administration is going to be all about.
I guess one of the interesting things to me was just sort of seeing play out in real time the disconnect that can exist between the first in command and second in command. Whether you're talking about president, vice president, we saw that last year, obviously, in the White House and everything that happened after the election. But then to see this as another example of just how wide the gap can be between the governor of the state and the lieutenant governor, I think it paints politics, state politics, in a slightly different way. It's interesting because you start to wonder, you know, in terms of influence, a layman would probably assume that, you know, the lieutenant governor has quite a bit of say in terms of what the administration's policy is going to ultimately look like. But it seems pretty clear to me now, especially with how overwhelmingly favorable the reviews have been of Hochul and her work over the last several years, that it's almost as if she had less say in the policy than leaders from Senate and Assembly on the Democratic side. So it's very interesting. And also, I'll say, the way she has stepped up and really taken a very authoritative approach to how this whole thing starts, her administration starts. Obviously, she's got to deal with the prospect of running for re-election as soon as she gets into office, which is kind of a challenge in and of itself. But I would also assume that, and this is the first topic I wanted to get into, what are the expectations for that first year? The first year that's not only spent governing and cleaning up a mess made by Andrew Cuomo, but also having to campaign as well for a full term, given that, you know, any sudden sway one way or another over the next 6 to 8 months could potentially end her bid before it even begins.
Well, to back up for a second, when you talk about number one and number two, there's always an uneasy relationship there. because if you're a governor to a lieutenant governor or a president of the United States to a vice president, that second in command is probably plotting his future or her future run at your job, and wants to get all the power they can accumulate on their own. So you have a governor with a power base and a lieutenant governor who's attempting to build a future power base. So typically, the old saying about the vice presidency of the U.S. not being worth a warm bucket of spit, because you don't want to have that person have too much power. But one of the first things I look for, and it'll be interesting because power usually doesn't give itself up voluntarily, is whether we'll see the restoration of the balance between the executive and the legislative, because I can't believe there's another state in the union that has a less powerful and less consequential legislature than we do in New York.
And I think that sort of ties into my big question moving forward, which is, can Governor Hochul be progressive enough to please that wing of the party? And I think this is going to be a pretty good barometer, frankly, for how truly progressive the leaders in both of those respective chambers and the Democrats in those chambers collectively are. We hear a lot about liberal progressive policy, but trust when I say there are plenty of very progressive policies that the quote unquote far left have wanted to see implemented in New York State for years. And they range from universal health care all the way to different housing bills and things like that, environmental bills, things that if you kind of take the architecture of what people view progressive as being for what is supposed to be maybe the second or third most progressive state in the country, really should be no-brainers on policy. And yet, historically under Cuomo, we haven't seen it. Can Hochul shift that? Does she have time to shift that far enough so that she isn't viewed as another moderate, another Cuomo, another person who will do certain things to play to that side of the party, but not go all the way and not take policy as far as I would say a majority of Democrats would like to see it?
I think she'll certainly make a very strong attempt, and obviously on women's issues, she's going to be better and in a better position. I mean, when you're under a cloud of sexual misconduct charges, it's pretty hard to be an advocate for women's issues.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think that'll be a big push. And, there seems to be across the country a little more of a push towards some of these left social ideas. I mean, we have right now in the Congress, we've got the one basic infrastructure bill that can be done with budget reconciliation and no filibuster, and then we have that second so-called human infrastructure bill. So I think the mood is right, certainly in New York, if not across the country, for a push in that direction. And I think, one of the things she's going to want to do between now and election time is position herself as not Andrew Cuomo. I mean, the last thing you want to be seen as is just carrying on his legacy or his program.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of opportunity there. One of the first things that she did announce, of course, changes for schools, better guidance for schools, which frankly, a lot of education leaders were looking for that anyway. One of the things you sent over, which I thought was pretty interesting, was a question around the state partnering with a certain pharmacy instead of just all of the pharmacies for testing and sort of the back-to-school work that has to be done. What were your thoughts on that? And give our listeners a little bit of background in terms of how we got there.
Well, first off, the testing in general, I think that's great. I've said one of my biggest criticisms since the beginning of the pandemic is that in the past, when you have an outbreak, you identify the people who have it and keep them away from the ones who don't. In this outbreak, a lot of our policies were basically to assume everyone has it, and then we start shutting the doors on businesses and things. But what I found interesting when I saw the release is that the state is partnering with Rite Aid to do this testing. Now that's one chain, and I assume these are free tests to the taker, but I'm assuming that the state is reimbursing costs to Rite Aid for doing this testing. I could be wrong there, but I assume this is going to be a pretty good moneymaker. So I was just a little surprised. Why not CVS? Why not Wegmans? Why not Walmart? Or anybody else who wants to take part? And there might be a very innocent answer to that. Maybe CVS has a lot more drive-up windows than the other ones do or something, because this is drive-up testing. But I just thought, my interest is always piqued when government is pushing some for-profit entities ahead of others, and it kind of seems like that's what is being done here. But the overall policy, I like it. I like the idea of let's test people, find out who's got it, keep them out of school, and then everyone else can be safe.
Yeah, I agree on the transparency and accountability side, because that's just a transparency issue. It really comes down to this question: why is government partnering with one commercial entity and not others? And even if there is an innocent answer, and they explain that innocent answer, you're still going to have a chunk of the population who does not trust that answer, does not believe government, and that is just a reflection of where we stand right now with government. And that's why, before you get to this point, if you are government, if you're writing press releases for New York State and listening to this podcast, I guess, think about this beforehand, and think about the optics of it, and think about what that means and what you're doing, and all of that. It just seems like at this point, everyone should know better. Everyone in state government should know better than to go down this road, and yet here we are going down this road. I'm also a little bit curious about how that works out because I'll use just some of the schools in the Finger Lakes area that I can think of. I can think of a handful of school districts that don't have a Rite Aid in immediate area. And I say immediate area, like not within a 15-minute drive. Now, what about the families and the part of the population, especially in rural communities where transportation is an issue, where you have all of these issues that have reared their ugly head throughout this pandemic? Why are you introducing a new way by which to have this issue? And by the way, the testing should be happening at school. The kids are going to school. Test them when they get to school if that's what you want to do. Get them out of school. Isolate them then. It just seems to me, because it feels a bit like this is being billed as an effort to prevent a major outbreak at a school. But guess what's most definitely going to happen in September, and probably in October and November and December, and probably all year, because what we're seeing with Delta and the other variants, there's going to be outbreaks. We're not going to be able to stop that. So make testing convenient, cast as wide a net as you possibly can. I think that's the reason for wanting to partner with more than one. Who cares where you're getting the test from? Make sure the people who live in all of these rural districts and these rural communities can get a test anywhere. Because I'll even say, from my own perspective, I've had a couple friends up in Rochester even who have had symptoms and then had to hunt down a test. It was not easy. The pharmacies are backlogged. You've got the testing sites, the central testing sites that were common last year, very uncommon now, especially since the shift has really moved to vaccination. I think the state will probably have to re-implement a lot of those large-scale testing facilities once we get into the meat of this fall and then winter.
I think that would be a good idea, especially we just put a poll up, and it's very preliminary. It's just been up for a very short time. But our poll at FingerLakesDailyNews.com asks, if you are unvaccinated, does the FDA Pfizer approval change your mind? And in the early going, 72%, I think, said no.
Right.
I don't think at this point you're not going to convince very many more people to get vaccinated. You might force them to, and that's a whole other issue and a whole other topic. And we're seeing that move underway now from corporate America, which one of the airlines, I think it is going to start charging a $200 a month surcharge to its employees who aren't vaccinated. Many companies are just saying, period, you vaccinate or you don't work here anymore. But yeah, and there was also a poll that came out the other day, or a survey of who's been vaccinated, and I believe the figure for rural residents was a little over 50%. So Whether that's because their political leanings are more to the right and they're refusing for political reasons, that might be some of it. But I think a lot of it is access reasons. It's those of us who live near conveniences think everyone does. And, in this area, we know there are a lot of rural places where it's a half an hour to the nearest Walmart.
I agree, and we're going to talk about the Delta and the Uniteds and Disney and all those large companies that are setting out mandates in terms of employees getting vaccinated. But I want to ask, when you say that, and obviously the poll has only been up for a short amount of time on the website, but when you see that, does it feel like refusal to get vaccinated at this point is more of a political statement than it is anything else? Because I'll be honest, in full disclosure, this is me giving my opinion. This is not news, but it feels like it's more of a political statement at this point than it is anything else. In the same way that group of people who are refusing to get vaccinated have suggested throughout the pandemic that a mask is a symbol of being someone on the left. I
think you're correct. This was, I believe, it was an NBC News survey of who's been vaccinated. Joe Biden voters in the 2020 general election, 91%. Yeah. Donald Trump voters in 2020, something like 50%. So I think at this point, a lot, not all, but a significant portion of the holdouts, it's political. And I think the more you urge them to get it, the more they harden their position. I think so. I don't think you're going to convince people anymore. Even the doctor. I know you had said earlier, if doctors tell people they should get it, that might move the needle, and maybe it will some. But I really think at this point, we've had the ability to be vaccinated has been there now since about January, I think. I think we're about 7 or 8 months into the vaccination push. If you don't have it at this point, with few exceptions, it's not because you can't get it. It's because you don't want to do it. Mm-hmm. And the more that what people see as the left or the Biden administration or the Democrats are telling me to do this, the more their position hardens that they won't.
I'm still fairly optimistic. I still stand by that. I still stand by my hunch that as doctors' offices are able to roll it out, especially now that boosters are starting to happen, and just from a getting it done point of view, in order to get booster shots out effectively, all of those are going to have to be administered, or most of those are going to have to be administered in doctors' offices. And I think in that environment, I think we can shift. But let's talk about the vaccine mandates at work in particular. United Airlines say they are going to be terminating any employee who doesn't get the vaccine, I believe, by September 27th. Delta Airlines says they're charging workers $200 per month as part of their call it your premium for health insurance through the company. And then a number of other employers, large ones obviously, Disney, some others, have just simply said, look, this is what's happening. You're either going to get the vaccine or you're not going to work for us. End of discussion. 2 questions. One I already know the answer to because I did some digging this morning. Is it legal? Yes, it's legal. The second question that we've been getting is this going to be an effective way to get people vaccinated? And my belief is that, yes, it will be, because I don't think you're going to suddenly see 40, if the belief is that 40% of the population is not vaccinated and is unwilling to get vaccinated in parts of the United States, I don't think you're going to see this group of people just say, well, I guess I'm not going to be employed anymore. Because let's remember what they've been yelling and screaming about for the last 6 months. Nobody wants to go back to work. This really comes down to, in my view at this point, the most effective way to get closer to that 90-100% vaccinated rate. Because, we've seen, it's not going to work with government, public health officials, maybe even doctors aren't really well suited to do it. So where do you go? You go to where people work, and one way or another, it happens. What are your thoughts on the employment mandate?
I agree with you that it will be effective.
Yeah,
it's just, and I understand the argument. The argument is that sometimes we have to do things for the greater good. That's part of what a society is, and that's part of the real big debate, really, that's raging in our country, is the rights of the individual versus the rights of the group or of the good for the society. But having said that, it frightens me. If the government or if your employer can force you to be injected with a drug, what can't he force you to do? And I know, that a lot of my left friends they dismiss that argument, the slippery slope, right out of hand. But I don't think you can. I mean, okay, so now in 2021, my employer can force me to be injected with a drug. What about 2022? What will be the next thing that someone will force me to do because I don't want to do it on my own?
So I guess the argument to that would be what we've seen play out with the U.S. military for decades now, which is that vaccines, good, bad, indifferent, trial, true and tested, everything in between, have been mandated for literally decades.
But you also know going in, that's what you signed up for. I mean, there's no draft anymore. So if you sign up for the military,
right,
you know that's a condition of employment. For people working in these airlines, when they signed up to work there, no one told them, oh, by the way, we can force you to become vaccinated.
So, and then the other part of that would be, a lot of folks who work in healthcare have to get different vaccines, MMR vaccines, things like that, just to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. And frankly, I think it falls pretty much in line with that. And look, like at the end, we're seeing right now, colleges and universities, they have for years mandated that kids get a whole range of vaccines and be up to date on all the vaccines that they
right.
need to be up on before they go to campus.
And I'm very conflicted by this. I'm not saying I'm 100% against the mandate. It raises a question that I can't adequately answer. I'm still debating that in my head because I understand the point of it, and I think it will be effective, and that might change the argument. If it is effective and this thing goes away, then maybe people will say, you know what, they were right.
Well, and I think for the people who make the slippery slope argument, and I'm sure you've heard this to some degree or another at some point, but I would argue that we're already going down the slippery slope. If that's going to be your take, that oh no, that's starting us down a slippery slope.
Right.
We've been going down that slippery slope for 50 years.
The idea that government would withhold money from your paycheck someday would have been unthinkable to the pioneer in 1750 out clearing the woods with his axe.
And it's just, frankly, it's part of the evolution of society. It's part of the evolution of a developed nation. It's part of, it's not that you're giving up freedoms. It's you're doing things so that you can have freedom. I mean, it really isn't any more complicated than that. And I know there are going to be people who are listening to this who get very upset with the fact that I'm saying that. But
I think it is more complicated than that. But I don't violently disagree with you. That's what I'm saying. It raises questions that I still don't have answers for in my own mind.
Well, and it's interesting because now taking this whole vaccine debate a step further, we now see the debate happening on whether to boost or not. And it has nothing to do with another dose of the vaccine, and it has everything to do with the World Health Organization saying developed nations like the United States should hold off due to the inequity of vaccine distribution across the planet. You've got variants like the Delta variant and some of the others that we've seen crop up, and we've also heard talk about like a Covid19 and some of these like super variants that are lurking out, and most of them are originating in places where vaccine access is still very, very poor. So essentially the argument there is, hold off at least for a few months. Let's get the vaccine, let's get doses 1 and 2 in the arms of people of these developing nations so that these variants start to wane off. But it seems like despite that, there isn't any interest in pumping the brakes. But what do you think? Like when you see that now within the next 30 days, probably most people are going to be eligible for a booster shot. Do you think the U.S. should be taking that lead role and saying, hey, we're going to pump the brakes now. We're not going to do it, even though it doesn't seem like that's in the cards at all?
Well, we're not going to do that. And as unfair as it might be to the rest of the world, that's one of the advantages you get from living in one of the richest countries on earth. I'm not 100% convinced that the boosters are really necessary. And in my own case, I had the one-shot Johnson & Johnson. Their study just came out showing that that particular vaccine seems very robust, and you keep your antibodies for a long period of time. It also shows that the booster raises it up even more. And we had this conversation on my show this morning, which is, do I really need to go from 99.999999% sure to 0.9999 add 5 more nines?
Yeah.
Is that really necessary? And like I've said before, it's being skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry in America is not a big leap by any means. You do have to ask yourself at a certain point, are we doing this for public health, or are we doing this to enrich Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson?
Yeah, it's a real question. So let's talk a little bit about masking. You actually sent this one over, I think. Expectation versus reality in terms of what masking has actually looked like. And I can just sort of share my own perspective. Living up in Monroe County, I live in Webster. We do a lot of our shopping in the Penfield, Webster area. And I will say whenever I go into a grocery store, it's probably like 30 to 40% masks and 60 to 70% unmasked. And they've got the signage up. They've got they're taking all of the steps that they can take as stores, right? They're being proactive. A lot of them have people in the front set up at stations, workers set up at the front with stations with masks, offering them to people. It seems like they're doing different things, but it doesn't really seem to be taking.
No. I was offered a mask recently walking into, I think it was the Geneva Walmart, unmasked. I'm seeing, I think, the same thing you are. A definite increase in masks over a few months ago, but it's not widespread. And I think a lot of it is, I think from the medical standpoint, you get vaccinated so you don't get the disease or give it to someone else. From a personal selfish standpoint, you get it so you don't have to go through all this stuff we went through in March of 2020. And I think a lot of people, and I lean towards this mindset myself, I got the vaccination. Why do I need to put this heavy cloth thing over my face on a 90-degree day like today to go in someplace? But I mean, according to the CDC, the CDC suddenly out of nowhere came out with these high and substantial, Governor Cuomo had red, yellow, orange, and now we've got high and substantial. By rights, almost every place here in the Finger Lakes, we should all be masking up anytime we go into any sort of indoor public facility.
Right.
That's not the case. We're seeing employees doing it in many places, and I think it's, I don't want to speak out of hand, I think it's being mandated in some of the corporate employers around here.
Correct.
Yep. Well, Wegmans is an example. I believe that they are one who are telling their workers that they should mask.
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, I'll post a note in the story attached to this video if I'm wrong, but I think it's Walmart, Wegmans, Tops, and maybe Aldi are all requiring masks among their staff.
I think so. And if they're not, the effect is the same. I mean,
right, you go in, they're all
100% masking up employees. But what you said, 30-40% seems about right to me. And then, we had the announcement just recently that both the State High School Sports Association and Section 5 are not going to tell the schools anything. They've left it to the schools, and I spoke with Mike Payne, the athletic director at Romulus and former football coach at Geneva. He said when the athletic directors got together and met, the overwhelming consensus was they wanted to play. So essentially, barring changes between now and a week from Friday, the high schools in the Finger Lakes are defying the CDC recommendation because football is considered a high-risk sport. It was postponed last fall. They're ignoring that. So it just seems to me this CDC guidance, I think there's just a growing opinion among people that we aren't going to do this anymore. Hey, I got my vaccination. I did what you told me to. Leave me alone now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a big driver of that has just been the lack of faith that that people have in government to do the right thing or to make just, accurate decisions. I mean, scrutiny is one thing, being skeptical is another thing, and it's pretty apparent that most people are at least skeptical of something or all things that government is doing in terms of mandates and rules and of that.
And I think a big part of that, we talked about this in the last couple of days as well, is just the complete muddied, mixed messaging that has, all the way through this. I mean, every conservative talk show in America has got a loop queued up of Dr. Fauci saying you don't need to wear a mask, you do need to wear a mask, you don't, you do. I mean, back to the very beginning. I've said this 100 times. My listeners are, what's coming, and you're tired of it already, I know. But when this pandemic started, it was wear a mask so you don't have to be 6 feet apart, or be 6 feet apart so you don't have to wear a mask. It was never both. Then suddenly out of somewhere it became both. So the CDC and the NIH and local health departments all saying different conflicting things for a year and a half. And I think that's a big part of it, is just this fatigue. I've made the joke, they said follow the science, and my joke all along has been you have to throw the science away every day and make sure you have today's science, because it may not say what yesterday's did.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it just sort of shows the gaps that exist in what we've been experiencing over the last 18, 19 months. Speaking of those gaps, the Auburn Citizen had a great story yesterday about COVID-19 reporting and the confusion of a change in how Keuka County is now going about reporting their daily numbers. Now it seems they're separating lab positives and at-home positives, creating a lot of confusion, not really being specific about how many new cases there are on a day-to-day basis, it seems. And the only question I have still to this day, and I tweeted it out last night, why do we not have a uniform process for every county and municipality to follow in the entire state? Because I'll tell you what, the number one, because we cover more than just one county here at Finger Lakes One, the number one question that we get, or series of questions, pertains to, when we're talking about COVID reporting and COVID numbers, pertains to how to interpret the data when one county is reporting it this way and another county is reporting it this way. And what does this mean, and how does this affect the way I should be going about my life? And frankly, it's kind of disappointing after 19 months not being able to give them an answer, because even if, and this is the example that I was thinking of last night, you have two counties that have identical situations. They have identical numbers, identical everything. Even if the only thing the two counties do different is one releases a weekly report and the other one releases a report every day or every 2 days, the way that those numbers are going to be digested are going to be completely different. They're going to be interpreted completely different. And thereby, the people who live in those communities are going to think that they and their neighbors are going through something completely different, even though they are living the exact same scenario. It's crazy.
A few things. Crazy. Number one is anyone reporting any numbers ought to be using a 7-day rolling average, or whatever rolling average you choose, because certain times, for example, we've got Labor Day coming up.
Oh, yeah.
So government offices are going to be closed on Labor Day. They're going to be, for all intents and purposes, closed the Friday before Labor Day. People are going to be taking off at noon. The day after Labor Day, you're just getting back on holiday mode. So the numbers that get reported during that period are going to be very low. And then all the backlog will hit on Wednesday or Thursday, and it will seem that we've had this big surge right after Labor Day, when what we've really had is just an office being closed for holidays. What I have been doing for a long time now, the problem with cases, when you say there have been this many cases, what you're really saying is there have been this many positive tests. And positive tests are a function of total tests. Without knowing how many total tests were done and who's being tested, that number is not consistent from month to month. When a few months ago we thought we had beaten this pandemic, people stopped getting tested. So the number of cases went way down. Now that there's fear that it's back and there's fear of variants, now more people are getting tested and the numbers are going up. So the number I've been looking at is the number of COVID deaths, because to me that's that's a number that you can't really, and setting aside the argument, are there being deaths counted as COVID that really shouldn't be? That's a separate argument. But if you look at the number of deaths, to me that gives you really kind of an accurate picture of where we are. And if you do that, as of right now, I believe in the United States, the 7-day rolling average daily deaths is somewhere around 1,000. That is still below where we've been for probably 70% of the pandemic. It's about where we were at this time last year, and last year we had a flattening out leading into September and October, and then a big giant jump up going into the winter months. So I would tell people to not look at number of cases, because again, that number is going to be low anyway, because unless you test everyone, you don't know how many cases there are. If there's 100 people in a town and I test 4 and they all test positive, does that mean everybody in town has it? We don't know. Yeah. So there's problems, but I kind of digressed a bit, as I sometimes do, but it would be nice if there were standard apples-to-apples comparisons that you could make.
Even if it were just a form. Something.
Right.
Anything just to sort of simplify
something
it.
Consistent.
A couple businesses in Keuka County were fined. I should say a couple more businesses were fined for violating COVID mandates, restrictions from earlier in the year. The inspections, I believe, took place as far back as September of 2020, but apparently Keuka County just got around to fining them now. The question I have now at this point is, does this practice need to end? Like, at what point does the county that's facing obviously a almost year-long backlog of investigation into COVID mandate violations just say, all right, we're throwing the towel in, we're moving on to bigger and better things like, keeping people safe and healthy and all that kind of stuff? Does the practice need to end as far as backlogging all these apparent violations that happened before? Keuka County is the example I'm using now, but it's not the only. They are not the only offender.
Well, because I don't think they were equally applied. For example, bars were inspected probably hundreds of times more often than hardware stores or name some other retail category. I mean, it just wasn't done evenly and equitably at all. When we had the Cuomo chips, back in the early spring or whatever it was of 2020, they were sending inspectors out to bars regularly to try to find them violating, but that wasn't being done in other sectors of the economy. So, quick answer, yes. There's no good purpose served by making some small business have to pay a fine for this.
Yeah, so, it's just interesting to me that we're in this scenario where this is just another example of how unprepared a lot of these counties were to do. And, they're using Keuka County as an example since we talked about them in the last story. They were able to come up with a new system for reporting COVID cases, but we're unable to get these fines processed in anything under, several months. I mean, that's just, to me, it doesn't work out. Let's talk a little bit about misinformation. We see plenty of that online, right? Nearly half of the U.S. wants government to kill misinformation online and on social media, according to new Pew Research. The number was about 48% of respondents, which was up approximately 10% from the last time they conducted that study. Can freedom of speech and information coexist if the government is given the responsibility of policing content?
No. Number one, no. Number two, it won't work.
Right.
Because when we talk about getting rid of misinformation, if I'm a Democrat, I'm talking about the idea that Donald Trump won the election. If I'm a Republican, I'm talking about the idea that Joe Biden won the election. Both will say, so we can't even begin to agree on what's misinformation. I mean, you might police the most blatant of it, but I'm not sure even that is going to be a success. That's why we have this problem. It isn't so much because of misinformation. It's because we have two sides of the political divide who have their own truths now. We never thought we'd find a day where one side thinks the sky is one color, the other side thinks it's the other color, and they're both convinced they're right.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any feasible way for the government to step in and do it well. that's the bigger issue.
What would be better, we'd better service as a society were education so that people could determine for themselves what's true and what's absurd. That's the sad part, is that some of the real egregious, absurd stuff, so many people believe it. I mean, we all see friends that put some meme on Facebook and you just want to go, oh my God, that was debunked as a myth 7 years ago. Where have you been?
Yeah, and it's an education problem. We've talked about that before. Residents are also getting frustrated over marijuana legalization in Skidiatlas. This also is nothing new. We're seeing countless communities, municipalities go through this problem, mainly because of the opt-out clause that the marijuana legalization bill that was signed into law this past spring poses. And it gives any municipality the opportunity to opt out via zoning. We've talked about that before, but now it seems the debate is getting a little more heated in certain communities. What are your thoughts on that and how that's playing out?
Well, I think it was probably a mistake to put an opt-out in the first place. I mean, I'd love to opt out of the income tax. There's times when I'm in a hurry, I'd like to opt out of the traffic laws and be able to speed with impunity, but we can't. I mean, when something's been made legal, I think it's time to stop fighting it tooth and nail. There's just, and I've never understood, I'm one of those people, why alcohol is socially acceptable when it causes way more death, damage, destruction, work absences, health problems, and everything else than pot ever could. Yeah. So there's a lot of people just don't want to give up the fight. They just, and I mean, there's legitimate concerns. Do you want, a pot dispensary 200 feet from a high school? I understand those things, but I really think it's people trying to keep the fight alive, and I do not understand it. You take plant material and light it, and that's bad. You take other plant material and ferment it and drink it, and that's okay. I don't understand the dichotomy. There are just a lot of people that will tell you they're not even close to the same. But to me, it's people have been putting substances into themselves to get a buzz, since Eve found the apple. I mean,
yeah, and I think when I think about it, I look at it through more of an economic lens, and to me, the risk is in a lot of these communities where they're going to be economically beat by their neighbors. And then you have some of these outlier situations where I'll use Seneca Falls as an example, or even, I guess, the town of Fayette or the town of Varick. The Keuka Nation owns land in all of those communities, and if any of them were to, say, ban these dispensaries, the Keuka Nation is essentially given a green light to open up a dispensary and be guaranteed not to have any opposition or competition in those communities. So I think it just creates, there are all these caveats where if you do go down this road of opting out, you're just setting yourself up for all kinds of headache down the road.
Well, in your first argument, the economic one, that's the argument that Supervisor Venuti from the town of Geneva made with me, is he said, why would we ban it if somebody can open up a place in the city, a mile away from the town? It's like you said, you can't, opting out isn't going to stop people from buying this legal product. It's just going to stop your community from reaping the tax benefits that were set up, as there are with alcohol. I mean, that's one of the reasons alcohol is so socially acceptable, is it's a significant source of tax revenue.
Yeah, and I mean, it was last spring, when I had a conversation with Chairman Jack Marin from the Ontario County Board of Supervisors, who, at that point, this was, a year before the actual passage and signing of the law, talking about the potential upside for farmers and agriculture, specifically in rural communities, and the opportunity that marijuana legalization would ultimately grant those areas. And, sure enough, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, I've seen more and more stories framing that part of it, where, farmers are now, they know it's going to be legalized. Now they're waiting for the implementation, which has proven to be a little bit complicated. But they're eager to see it happen because they know that it can help them in what has been a pretty rough 5 or 6 year stretch for farmers across the state.
Think of the increase in lava lamp and blacklight poster sales. I mean,
absolutely. So last topic of the day, and oh my God, this is one that kind of caught me by surprise. I didn't even see it on the radar until it actually happened. I had actually forgotten that there were a couple stories in March, April, and May. The city of Auburn, through the police department, took control of 8 Delavan Street. Obviously, that property, it's called the nuisance property, but really it's the place where the police are called all the time. And there was a homicide there 2 years ago, and that's really all the description you need of said property. It's interesting because it was treated as an outlier, but it seems like there is room for kind of like permanent policy in terms of how these nuisance properties, or even properties that don't necessarily fit in with what the goals of the community or the comprehensive plans and all of that actually reflect on the community. So what do you think about what happened there, and then also how transferable that process might be going forward for communities like Auburn who want to get those nuisance properties, or even just properties that are in severe neglect, under control?
Well, sometimes the wheels of justice turn slowly, but yeah, I mean, I remember we discussed this a few months back here on the podcast. So they were finally able to do it. I guess one of the problems is trying to come up with a definition of a nuisance property that is fair and that stands up to legal scrutiny or any kind of a challenge. I mean, I don't know if you can say, okay, if police get called out X number of times, or if this or if that. So I think that's part of the challenge is, you know, we all know these places, and we all know in almost any community there's one or more of them. It's coming up with a good definition and a good process for being able to do what they took several years to do in Auburn with Delavan.
Yeah, and I guess my curiosity is, like, you know, it would have to be done through zoning, and I believe they've reinstated the zoning committee that would oversee this process in the city of Auburn. But I think, kind of going back to what our conversation was the first time when we talked about this, and I'm even thinking before that springtime conversation, when we talked about rental properties and getting a good sense in every community of what the rental stock looks like and what those properties range at in value, and how much money and deterioration has happened or been invested into those places. I think that is probably where the real opportunity is for communities like Auburn or any other for that matter.
Another issue is, and I don't remember whose report it was, but I just heard a report come out today saying that a significant number of landlords collected 50% or less of their rents in 2020. So you've got, we always talk about the dearth of good affordable housing. Now you have owners of housing who haven't been getting their income and are of necessity going to have to skimp on maintenance and things. So I think in this case, the pandemic might actually make this problem worse down the road.
Well, and to take that problem a step further even, and say, you know, not only is it going to prompt that, but it's probably going to prompt some of these properties to be sold. And then who's going to buy these properties? Probably absentee landlords or large corporations that do the whole property management thing. And as we've seen in places like Auburn and Geneva and other cities like that, and even smaller towns, it's not only bad for the people who live in those areas and bad for the people who wind up having to live in those homes, but it's also bad for the housing market itself. Whoa, the housing market itself.
Right. I mean, absentee ownership rarely is to anyone's benefit.
Yeah. So that's going to be all for today, Ted. Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Auburn, that's 96.3 and 1590 WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 and 1240 WGVA.
All right. Thanks for listening. You can hear Ted Monday through Friday on Finger Lakes News Radio, and be sure to join us back here next week. See you then.